Through the centuries, many a nation has received recognition as a home of such brave warriors well into the 20th century. Whether it be America's Patton, Britain's Bernard Montgomery, Rommel of Germany, or Ho Chi Minh of Vietnam, the names of these warriors are well known around the world. However, this documentary is not about them. It is about the actions of brave men and women in uniform during the century that changed the world. The individuals in this documentary share a border north of the United States and have fiercely fought side by side Britain, the United States, and their other allies with little recognition. This is the story of Canada's military from the Second Boer War in southern Africa to the trenches of World War I to the bloody battlefields of World War II and the mountainous hells of the Korean War. This is Four Wars, Canada's Forgotten Triumphs. Canada's first overseas war is its own name when the Afrikaans-speaking Boer, descendants of Dutch settlers in South Africa, composing of the South African Republic, an Orange Free State, declared war on the British Empire in South Africa in 1899. When it seemed that the Boer forces were the winning side, the British, shocked at the capability of the guerrilla-style enemies, began using scorched earth policies. Towns, villages, crops, and anything which could prove useful to those who opposed the British was destroyed. In addition, and in one of England's darker chapters, concentration camps were erected to imprison the Boer people. Many of the Canadians who arrived in time for the fighting found themselves guarding these primitive and more often than not filthy camps where thousands of innocent people would die of disease and malnourishment before the end of the war in 1902. However, Canada did take part in the battles of Paardeberg, Zand River, Doornkop, and most notably, Lillifontaine. During the Battle of Lillifontaine, a joint British-Canadian force executed an operation to find and eliminate Boer commando units operating in Belfast. However, once reaching the farm at Lillifontaine, the British, fearing their supply lines were stretched too thin, ordered a retreat. It was during this retreat that the Royal Canadian Dragoons were given the task of acting as a rear guard to cover the British retreat. Shortly after the retreat began, the Boers launched a heavy assault against the Canadians, with the hopes of capturing the Dragoons' two 12-pound artillery guns. During the battle, the Canadians were outnumbered 3-1 during the heavy fighting. The Dragoons, however, positioned themselves between the artillery and the attacking Boer troops in order to allow the guns and their crews time to escape. For this action, the Victoria Cross, the highest award for any Commonwealth nation, was awarded to 3 of the Dragoons. This was the highest number of Victoria Crosses awarded to Canadian troops in a single battle, with the exception of Vimy Ridge later in the First World War. The Second Boer War ended as a British victory with the annexation of the Orange Free State and South African Republic. Both would be incorporated into the Union of South Africa by 1902. More than 7,000 Canadians had served during the Second Boer War, and 270 died. Canada's next conflict would see the number of casualties skyrocket. In 1914, European imperialism led to war in Europe after the Germans invaded the neutral countries of Belgium and Luxembourg on the way to France. The British and French declared war on the German Empire. On August 5, 1914, the Canadian government declared a state of war between Germany and Canada. Almost all of Canada felt a surge of duty and an obligation to fight against any foe of their mother country, Great Britain. Canada entered the war with little national identity as their own people, but instead as subjects of the British Empire, along with Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and other Commonwealth nations. In the end, each of these nations would come out of the carnage with a new sense of independent pride for their own nations. The Canadian Expeditionary Force saw its first action in the town of Neuville-Chapelle in order to prevent the Germans from reinforcing their troops in this sector. This action allowed the British First Army to break through the German lines in order to establish a new Allied front. In the end, however, the British were unable to fully exploit this breakthrough, largely due to the poor communication. For the Canadians, though, the mistakes made by the British were observed as a lesson in what to do and what not to do in battle. In April 1915, at the Second Battle of Ypres, the 1st Canadian Infantry Division was moved into a salient where British and French troops had pushed too far into German lines. The Germans launched an attack to wipe out this salient, deploying lethal chlorine gas. The British and French fell back as their ranks crumbled under the effects of this terrible weapon. With a gap in the line 4 miles wide, the Canadians were the only division able to hold their position and fight. Later that month, the Germans launched another poison gas attack, killing over 2,000 Canadian troops. The battle ended in a stalemate, which would not be broken up until 1917. In the Battle of the Somme, which saw the greatest loss of life in British military history in a single day, the Canadians, having suffered 24,029 casualties themselves, earned even more of a reputation as formidable fighters, when British Prime Minister Lloyd George stated, "The Canadians played a part of such distinction that thenceforth they were marked out as shock troops, for whenever the Germans found the Canadian Corps coming into the line, they prepared for the worst." However, it would be the Battle of Vimy Ridge that truly earned Canadians their national identity from the British. During the Arras offensive, the Germans held the high ground along the escarpment to the north. Previous attacks from the British and French had failed, but on Easter Monday, April 9, 1917, at 5:38 a.m., the Canadians launched their attack. Having perfected the creeping barrage technique of moving behind artillery fire in order to sneak up on the enemy, the Canadians captured their first objective, the Black Line, in less than an hour. For the first time in the war, all 4 Canadian divisions attacked. The next day, and in ferocious fighting, the town of Theilloux had been captured along with several other key objectives. Without let-up, the Canadians pushed forward until the night of April 12th, when Vimy Ridge was firmly in control of the Canadians. The Canadians suffered 3,598 killed and 7,004 wounded during the fighting for Vimy. It is unknown how many Germans were killed during the fighting. Throughout the rest of the war, the Germans made no attempt to recapture the ridge. This battle is known as the greatest victory in Canadian military history. Later that year, Canada played part in another pivotal battle at the Belgian town of Passchendaele. Sir Douglas Haig launched an attack to break through the front and destroy the German submarine bases on the Belgian coast. Over the course of several months, British and Anzac troops of Australia and New Zealand had suffered over 100,000 casualties, with little gains made. On October 26, the Canadians launched a series of assaults against the German lines, and in 4 days, on October 30th, Passchendaele was secured by Canadian and British forces. The battle ended in early November at the cost of 15,654 casualties. For the remainder of the war, which now saw the entrance of the Americans, the Canadians and other Allied forces would launch a series of attacks along the Western Front known as the 100 Days Offensive, ending on the last day of the war, November 11, 1918. From 1914 to 1918, in gruesome trench warfare, World War I claimed the lives of 67,000 Canadians, with more than 173,000 wounded. Canada came out of the First World War with a newfound sense of national identity as a nation separate from Great Britain. One of the great unknown facts in history is the name Private George Lawrence Price, a Canadian soldier, as well as the last soldier to be killed in World War I. He was killed only 2 minutes before peace was declared. When Britain declared war on Germany in World War I, Canada was still a dominion of the British Empire and thus was immediately pulled into the war. However, by the late 1930s, Canada was officially independent to make its own decisions free from the English. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. By September 3rd, Britain and France declared war on Nazi Germany. World War II had begun. After 7 days of debate in Ottawa, the Canadian Parliament on its own declared war on Hitler's Germany and on Fascist Italy the next day. Canada, however, was still hurt by the Great Depression, and after gaining its independence from England, saw an undermanned military. The war did present the opportunity to pull itself out of this depression by producing valuable war materials for Britain and France, such as food, ammunition, and raw metals. In fact, half of Allied aluminum in the war and 90% of Allied nickel would be provided by Canada. With the U.S. still remaining neutral, Canada was the only nation in the Americas to declare war on fascist aggression in Europe. By 1940, it was apparent that Canada would sooner or later enter combat overseas, and by the end of the year, 200,000 had enlisted. With the Germans headed towards France, Canada sent troops to Britain in order to serve with the British Expeditionary Force in France. By June 1940, the Canadians had arrived in France at the same time the British and French were surrounded at the port of Dunkirk. After pushing 200 kilometers inland, the Canadians returned to Brest and then Britain. 1940 and 41 saw German victories across Europe, and in the summer of 1941, the Germans began their invasion of Russia with Operation Barbarossa. For the West, this meant one more powerful ally on their side. Throughout the war, Canada would supply the Soviet Union with Valentine tanks along with numerous other war materials. But the big break came on December 7, 1941, when the Japanese attacked the United States naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, bringing America into the war. On that day of the sneak attack, Canada declared war on Japan, though most of the action seen by Canadian troops would be in Europe. Canadians did, however, distinguish themselves in the defense of Hong Kong alongside the British before the city fell, and later would fight alongside Americans to repel the Japanese invasion of the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, including members of the elite Devil's Brigade, commandos made up of Canadian and U.S. troops. With most of the Commonwealth forces engaged in fighting in North Africa, including a small number of Canadians, in 1942 a commando raid was devised by British commandos targeting the French coast. On August 19, 1942, the British launched a raid at the French town of Dieppe with a force of 5,000 Canadians, 1,000 Brits, along with 50 U.S. Army Rangers. However, the element of surprise had been lost, yet the British gave the order to go ahead with the operation. Naval gunfire was limited to avoid civilian casualties, leading to the Canadians of the untested 2nd Division storming a heavily defended beach with no naval support. Due to the incompetence of the British commanders, the raid proved disastrous, with no objectives being accomplished, and 3,367 dead, wounded, or captured Canadians. To this day, the Dieppe raid is still a controversial part of history. By 1943, the Canadians were frustrated at the lack of overseas action. The invasion of Sicily was a welcome to battle-eager troops, and would be their first large-scale engagement of the war. That same year they landed during the Allied invasion of mainland Italy. Canadian troops took part in the major battles from Monte Cassino, the Moro River, the assault on the Hitler Line, and most notably Ortona, a coastal town on the Adriatic Sea which would prove valuable to the Allies as a port of supplies. The Canadian forces, including a large armored force pushing along the coast towards Ortona, were informed by the British that German resistance would be light. When the Canadians entered the small town of Ortona on December 20th, they became engaged in fierce close-quarters combat with the elite German Fallschirmjäger paratroopers for 8 straight days before finally capturing the town. The fighting for Italy and Sicily had claimed over 25,000 Canadian casualties, with more than 1,000 in Ortona alone. One German captured in Italy went as far as to say that the Canadians were better night fighters than the Americans. By this time in the war, the Germans were on the defense, and the Allies were now focused on their next objective, the invasion of Europe, which would come on June 6, 1944, D-Day. On June 6, 1944, the 3rd Canadian Division landed on the Normandy coast on the sector code-named Juno Beach, sustaining heavy casualties in their first hour of the landing, despite encountering the second heaviest resistance put up on either beach, with the exception of the Americans at Omaha. The Canadians had penetrated deeper inland into France than either the British or American troops by day's end. The Canadian and Polish forces began pushing deep into France, encountering heavy resistance in an area where the Germans were still hanging on, known as the Falaise Pocket. During the fighting in and around the pocket, Canadian tank crews began fighting some of the most experienced panzer units in the German military, including Germany's most famous tank ace, Michael Wittmann, an SS tank commander with 138 destroyed tanks to his credit. Many historians believe it was the troops of the Canadian Sherbrooke Fusiliers Regiment that killed Wittmann. The Canadians also recaptured the strategically important town of Caen after the British allowed it to fall to German hands. After the fighting for France, the Canadians pushed into Belgium, Holland, and the Netherlands. Canadians are credited as being a major force in the liberation of the Netherlands, which cost 7,600 troops. Other Canadian troops participated in the fighting in the Rhineland and were the country with the first troops to enter Amsterdam. Canada came out of World War II as a major nation of the world, with a strong economy and in military status had the 4th largest air force and 3rd largest naval surface fleet in the world. During the war, more than 45,000 Canadians were killed, with another 54,000 wounded. At the end of World War II, Canada had come out of its Second World War as a major player on the world stage. By 1950, though, Canada's military had been drastically reduced in numbers. On June 25, 1950, forces of the Soviet-backed communist North Korea invaded the Republic of Korea to the south. The communists swarmed across the 38th parallel with complete surprise and within days captured the South's capital city of Seoul. Later that same day, the United Nations drafted UNSC Resolution 82, calling for the end of North Korean presence in the Korean Peninsula. In a stroke of luck for the UN, Russia was not present at the hearing. Therefore, the decision to use military intervention was passed. Like the United States and Britain, Canada offered military assistance to the South, along with other UN nations, including members of the Commonwealth, such as Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. American General Douglas MacArthur was in charge of U.S. forces in the Far East. The HMSCS Cayuga, Athabaskan, and Sioux were the first 3 ships dispatched by the Royal Canadian Navy to serve in the Far East. The HMSCS Nuukta, Iroquois, Huron, Haiti, and Crusader would later join in the action. These ships would be among the most active of the war. The Cayuga, Athabaskan, and Sioux would provide naval gunfire during the famous and daring landing at Incheon in September, and would later join in the evacuation of UN troops and South Koreans and refugees during the retreat from the Chosin Reservoir after China entered the war. Canadian ships patrolled the coast, disrupting communist supply lines, most notably as part of the Train Busters Club. This was a group made up of any ship which destroyed trains along the North Korean coast. The Royal Canadian Navy would eventually rack up more train kills than any other UN nation in Korea, accounting for more than half of all railway supplies destroyed. Ships also served in carrying out commando raids along the North Korean shore. The 2nd Battalion Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, or Princess Pats, were the first Canadian ground troops to arrive in Korea. In December, Major Jim Stone put the troops through 8 weeks of training until February 6, 1951. One of the most famous engagements in Canadian military history, and by far their most notable in Korea, came at the Kapyong Valley in April, when Chinese troops overwhelmed South Korean and New Zealand troops, causing a full retreat south. The Americans and British soon joined along in the retreat towards Seoul through a gap, with Australians providing covering fire. The task was given to the Australians and Canadians to block the two approaches to Kapyong in order to halt the Chinese assault, in an all-out they shall not pass assignment. Within hours, the Canadians and Australians managed to set up defensive perimeters at Kapyong in anticipation of the Chinese attack. On April 23rd, the Chinese launched their attack against the Australians, and later the Canadians, both positioned on separate hills overlooking the valley at Kapyong. After fierce fighting, the Australians, facing encirclement, were ordered to fall back towards a new defensive position on the 24th. Canadian troops fired fiercely at the oncoming Chinese, who came attacking in human waves after blowing bugles, which chilled the soldiers of every UN nation in Korea. Eventually, the Chinese made their way into the Princess Pat's brigade position. Rather than retreat, the Canadians, who were now completely surrounded by an entire Chinese division, engaged the Chinese in bayonet, hand-to-hand, and grenade fighting. Soon Captain Mills, commander of D Company, ordered his artillery to be dropped right on top of the Canadian position on Hill 677. When asked if his men could get into a safe position, he confirmed that they had found cover, and then the howitzers began to fire. Canadians jumped into bunkers, foxholes, and trenches as shells exploded all around. The next morning, on the 25th, the Chinese abandoned the attack, which left 10 Canadians dead. However, the artillery barrage, which had been called in by Captain Mills, did not kill a single Canadian. For their actions at Kapyong, the 2nd Battalion Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, along with the 3rd Royal Australian Regiment, were awarded the United States Presidential Unit Citation for gallantry. The Canadian government debated for several years whether or not to let the battalion accept this award, until finally agreeing to allow the Princess Pats to keep their achievement. This was the first and only time in history that a Canadian unit was awarded this honor. A memorial stands in Kapyong today commemorating the bravery shown by the Pats. For the remainder of the war, other Canadian units served in actions during the intense hill fighting, like the costly battle for Hill 355 and Little Gibraltar, as well as the static warfare along the main line of resistance until the end of hostilities on July 27, 1953. Throughout the war, the Canadians were well respected by their foe and showed great humanity to the South Koreans, distributing food, taking care of the wounded refugees, and in some instances, paying to put Korean children through school and finding shelter for the orphans. The Canadian Air Force also played a pivotal role in transportation of supplies from Canada to Japan. In what is known as the Forgotten War, Canada lost 560 men, 312 of which were combat deaths. By the time Canadian forces left Korea in 1954, Canada had now been through 4 wars in the 20th century, distinguishing itself in each. Today, Canada continues to offer support around the world, mostly in peacekeeping and humanitarian operations. Canada has sent troops overseas to places such as Afghanistan, where as well as combat operations, they have helped to improve the lives of the civilian population. The main job of the Canadian military, however, remains to defend the North from aggression. Thanks to the men and women who served their country, from the Second Boer War to the trenches of World War I, where Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae wrote the famous poem In Flanders Fields, to the battlefields of World War II and the hills of Korea, Canada has made it clear to the world that the North is not up for grabs. The sacrifices made by this important ally of freedom has been confirmed in the last phrase of their national anthem, summed up in 8 words: O Canada, we stand on guard for thee.